I'm Catherine Barnett. Wow, that's a beautiful mic. Welcome. The last time I tried to tell a story, like a narrative, I pulled a muscle in my neck. And I was working at a magazine, and the art director said, well, take a Xanax. But I didn't know at that time what Xanax was. He said it's a muscle relaxant. So I took the Xanax. I was 29 years old, and I was on an assignment for an art magazine to try to write a story about these Hopi sacred objects that were being removed from the Hopi villages and sold on the Anglo market. I had flown to Arizona with a man I didn't know, a photographer, and the first night we found ourselves sleeping on the roof, the black tar paper roof of a Hopi priest and his family. Dan Budnick, that's the name of the photographer, was one of the few Anglo photographers who was invited to the Hopi reservation, and he had earned their trust. I've sometimes wondered if I should have been a private eye. I love figuring out what's really going on. I love seeing through lies. I seem to have a knack for it. What poetry shares with journalism and private investigation is the art of attention. Where it differs is in the quality of the knowing that comes with that attention, and what that knowing is used for and how it is used. Dan and I spent the night in borrowed sleeping bags under the stars above the Hopi priest and his extended family. They fed us, and the next day the priest showed us the kiva from which a sacred Hopi mask had been stolen. We weren't allowed inside. The mask had shown up at an antiques show here in New York City, and it had been seized by the FBI to be returned to the reservation. And I was out there trying to figure out how were these objects disappearing. I didn't figure out who was removing the sacred objects and selling them until I went to Santa Fe and met with a gallery owner there who was in the chain of buyers and sellers. He had bought the mask and he had sold it for over $100,000. And he played dumb when I was interviewing him, but I wasn't really fooled. And I came to realize he was part of a chain of disreputable people who had lured the Hopi priest's grandson, and possibly others, to steal the sacred objects from their rightful places. Back at home in New York City, I was supposed to write the magazine's feature story to accompany Budnick's photographs. I filled a huge cardboard box with notes and drafts and failed attempts. I had two problems. One problem was that I felt I didn't know enough. I didn't know enough about the Hopi culture. I didn't know enough about the sacred objects. I didn't know enough to write responsibly about that culture. And the second problem was I didn't want to say what I knew. The priest had trusted us. His entire family had been so generous. How could I break that trust? How could I hurt his family with a truth I didn't think they knew? The magazine had spent thousands of dollars on the research, the trip, the photographs, our flights, and the editor knew a good story when he heard one, and he was expecting me to turn something in. I kept missing deadlines after deadline, until eventually someone else was called in to write the story. Patrick Pacheco knew how to tell a story. But what is a story? I've been told that a story is something that happens in time, where something is changed irrevocably. It takes place in time. They put my byline there in the glossy magazine pages, beneath the title. And later that year, I met with a friend of mine who was a terrific investigative journalist, and he wrote long, complicated, powerful stories, and I told him the story of my story. He said, a journalist's only allegiance is to the truth, not to the people who help you find the truth. And I could see his point. So I quit the magazine, and I spent 2 years writing fluff for Martha Stewart Living. I made a small stash of money and then tried to make things up, tried to write a little fiction. But I still didn't know how. So I looked into the classifieds, and I found a teacher that I thought might be able to tell me how to make a narrative. I didn't understand conflict. I thought conflict was something you worked out and you talked about and you applied your psychological insights, and that was the end of it. And that teacher just had me write and write and write. She thought if I just kept writing, I would eventually, I guess it's like that monkey thing. I guess eventually you write Shakespeare. But that didn't happen. And I've never looked back at those pages. When that woman left town, that teacher, she gave me to her teacher, who was a wonderful poet who had trained as a psychotherapist. Every week or two, I would meet Ruth Dannon in her Greenwich Village apartment, and we'd sit on the floor, and she would take out whatever odds and ends she had around her house, boxes and jacks and balls and feathers, and she would tell me to make something, and then she would tell me to knock it over, and then she would tell me to make it again. And once she made me wear a red foam clown nose while we threw a ball back and forth. And then she would ask me to write as freely as I could, to write whatever came to mind. There was no question of trespass, of betrayal. I always doubted what I wrote, and then I'd read it back to Ruth, and she would help me try to figure out what it was I had written, what I had made, or what could be made out of that. After months of this, she looked up at me from the page where we sat reading side by side and reading my scrawled free writing, and she said, I think you might be a poet. A poet? I said, I can't be a poet. I'd been taught poetry so poorly, I thought a poet was a wholly other thing. I thought it required confidence and certainty, which is also what I had lacked as a journalist. Then don't call it a poem, Ruth said. Call it an aardvark. Maybe Ruth has said this to many students. I don't know. But once I began to let go of my previous notions of what made a poem, and instead thought about the wonderful idiosyncrasies of aardvarks, which look like they're made up of like 17 different animals, and began to think about where to break the line and to focus on language itself, on language as material and the energy created by breaking a line, I was flooded with energy, and I was headed into unknown territory. By which I mean territory where not knowing is as valuable as knowing. When I reread the magazine that has my name on it, I recognize only the opening and closing paragraphs. And I see that in the end, we didn't have to identify the priest's grandson by name. The name wasn't as important as the larger problem of Anglos taking advantage of the economic hardships of some Hopis in the villages. We did name the gallery owner responsible for the chain of thefts without outright accusing him of his role. I remember he wrote me a letter saying, I could almost sue you for libel, which I took as the very highest praise. Because that he could almost sue me for libel suggests I had found out the truth. He was arrested on other charges a few years later on. Though some of my own aardvarks tell true stories, I think they mostly seek to stop time, to keep time from having the final say, as it so often does. And I've learned that aardvarks are born with their eyes wide open, and they are said to be diligent and fearless. Thank you.